I woke up with a mouthful of cotton, a throat that felt like sand, and the steady, indifferent beeping of a monitor. My vision was a blur of fluorescent lights and the white grid of the ceiling above me. It took several slow, deliberate breaths before I noticed the phone on the bedside table. Its screen a bright, accusing stain, 73 missed calls. I listened to the voicemail with my hand pressed to the bruise at the base of my neck, trying to anchor myself in the ordinary. The rhythm of the beeps, the paper-thin privacy curtain, the smell of antiseptic. My father's voice filled the room, casual, almost cheerful, like he was telling me about the weather. "We sold your condo," he said. It was for Emily. We needed to take care of the wedding. That sentence, "they sold my condo," landed like a weight on my chest. My first thought was that I was still groggy from anesthesia, that the words were a hallucination brought on by morphine. My next thought was immediate and cold. They had done it while I was under. Have you ever been betrayed by someone who should have protected you? Tell me below. I learned to carry the ledger of my family's life in small, practical ways. I was the one who paid off the short-term loans when Dad's construction business stalled. I was the one who cleared the medical bills when Mom's back flared for a year. I took extra shifts, sold my car, signed the mortgage papers for that little condo when I was 28, because it was the only stable thing I could offer myself. I didn't buy it for status. I bought it because I needed a safe place that was mine, a place to keep the boxers that contained who I was when things around me felt chaotic. My childhood was threaded with the same pattern, compliments aimed at Emily like a spot, while I felt more like the stagehand, fixing the set so the show could go on. Emily was beautiful in a way that made adults smile. She was the one they took photos of at family gatherings. She was the one whose boyfriend they liked at dinner. I learned early to make myself useful, so my usefulness would be rewarded. It was a pragmatic kind of love. It suggested that care could be measured in who fixed which debt, who paid which bill, who smoothed over which embarrassment. 4 days before my surgery, I called Emily and told her the anesthesiologist wanted a relative on call. My voice trembled, but I chose facts over drama. I asked if she could come sit with me the night before, or at least be reachable. She responded with a flurry of wedding planning messages, cake samples, color swatches, a list of people who might help with the guest list. She was excited, distracted, the world orbiting her. My parents, who lived 5 minutes away, said they'd be fine. They'd come by after work. I trusted them because what else does a daughter do when the people closest tell her it will be fine? The voicemail was the fracture point. After I listened, I pressed call back with fingers that were shaky from more than pain. Dad picked up like nothing had happened. "We had to," he said, as if necessity made everything permissible. "Emily needs the rehearsal dress. We couldn't wait." I remember the space between words. It felt like an empty hall in which I could hear all the small betrayals echoing, the unpaid rent when I bailed them out, the Thanksgiving I spent covering for bad credit so their rental application would go through, the way complaints about my distance were framed as my fault. Rage tried to surface then, sharp and hot, but I had just come out of 9 hours of spinal surgery. My body was fragile, but my mind, under the haze, sharpened in the shape of a question. How? How had they done it? How had they moved so quickly? How had they made a legal transfer while my hands that signed every check, that carried the family through countless small disasters, were incapacitated? I called Aunt Ruth. She was older, blunt, and the person who still treated me like an adult when others softened me into a role. She listened, and then she fixed the first practical thing I'd been unable to focus on. Her voice was steady. "Don't say anything to them you'll regret," she said. "Call Mark. Get copies of the records. Let's see their paperwork." Mark Ellis was the kind of lawyer whose calm made the messy seem like a solvable equation. He came over a week later, sat on my sofa I'd bought after the divorce that wasn't really a divorce but a long separation, and unfolded a life of documents between us. His office smelled faintly of old books. He looked at me like I was someone who mattered and needed to be believed. The sale had appeared straightforward on the surface. A power of attorney, a wire transfer, an agent who claimed to represent me. But Mark's suspicions were not theatrical. They were professional and precise. He ran the chain of signatures, tracked timestamps, noticed tiny technical inconsistencies that didn't belong to my signature style. He asked when I had last granted anyone power of attorney, and I said never. There was a pause, the kind that small-town living creates long enough to hold a rumor. Then Mark said, quietly, "This looks forged." When the word came, it didn't explode into immediate vindication. It was a clinical observation that needed translation into action. We discovered that the deed to the house my parents had lived in 4 years was not owned by them in the straightforward way I'd assumed. Years earlier, while they'd been slipping behind on mortgage payments, I had used savings I'd kept for emergencies to buy the house anonymously through a limited company. I did it because I couldn't stand to watch them lose their home. I wanted my help to be the plumbing, functional, unseen. I never told them. I told only Aunt Ruth because I needed someone to look after the paper trail in case something went wrong. Mark told me about the lease tied to that property, about the small clause that made it expire not long after Emily's wedding. It was, in legal terms, a timing quirk. In human terms, it was leverage. That word landed in me without the usual righteousness of revenge. It was simply a tool, a way to restore what had been taken if the facts supported it. I wrestled with the ethics of what came next, the moral calculus that separates exposure from spectacle. I was not interested in shaming for the sake of a viral moment. I wanted to disrupt the casualness of permission, the manner in which my family had believed they could swap my security for their conveniences. I wanted to make it undeniable that this had been theft, and that theft has consequences. But how to make the world see? How to make the people whose lives were built on appearances understand that the polite smiles at a christening did not absolve the act of taking from the daughter who'd patched them together. There are private ways to fight. Letters, courts, quiet suits that roll along a bureaucratic treadmill for years. There are remedies that bleed you into paperwork and exhaustion. I rejected both. Not for drama, but because there was a moment coming, my sister's wedding, when faces would be turned toward a celebration, and truth shown in that space could not be so easily dismissed as family squabble. In the weeks that followed my wake-up call, my days were a study in contradiction, physical recovery and mental escalation. I learned to walk with a cane in public and to tighten my jaw in family rooms. Emily posted pictures of bridesmaid dresses and wedding invitations, tags and hashtags, a parade of smiles. On the same day, my father sent texts that toggled between dismissiveness and guilt-struck defensiveness. "We had to do something," he wrote. "You know how it is for a family." When they started turning the narrative on me, insinuations that I had been unsupportive, that I had been dramatic, that my reaction was selfish, I felt a cold clarity. The truth was a heavy thing, and public truth had power. But public truth also requires restraint, a precise hand, a clear voice, the kind of evidence that doesn't evaporate under denials. Mark prepared copies of documents. Aunt Ruth sat with me while we went over timelines and receipts. I learned to ask myself, in the small private hours overnight, what I intended to achieve. I did not want to humiliate for the sake of it. I wanted accountability, and I wanted to reclaim what was mine. If that reclaimed justice would unsettle my family publicly, then so be it. If it endangered relationships, then perhaps those relationships were already where they needed to be. There were nights I felt entirely alone. There were parties for which I was invited and did not attend. There were friends who whispered, trying not to look judgmental. There were social media posts that painted me as cold and unpredictable. Friends tried to be neutral. Strangers crafted opinions. The familiar script of choose family was flung at me, as if loyalty should swallow. When the rehearsal dinner came, you could feel the minor electric charge in the room. Relatives arranged themselves into alliances, and there was a loose choreography of excused apologies and toasts. Mom made a speech about gratitude. Emily smiled at people and pinched the ends of their hands with affection. I sat at the edge of the table and felt the seat support me because my body was still raw. I wore a dress that could have been one of Emily's bridesmaid pics if the gendered choreography of our family had been different. There was a moment at the rehearsal when Emily leaned close to me, the kind of intimate whisper that usually threaded forgiveness into place. "Can you please just let this go?" she said. "We need everyone there tomorrow, okay? For us." In that half-second, everything that had built up for years, the subtle exclusions, the invisible ledger of debts I'd paid crystallized. Let it go. A single sentence that carried the permission they'd exercised before. To borrow, to spend, to dispose of another person's security when it suited them.
I wanted to answer.
I wanted to hand them the proof and demand them to feel it. But I had a plan, not a temper. The night before the wedding, I hardly slept. I practiced the sentences I would use. Clear, unadorned, factual. I rehearsed the moment Mark would stand and authenticate the documents. I thought about how to prevent it from becoming a spectacle in the way the tabloids understand spectacle. My objective was to make the truth undeniable. On the day of the wedding, the hotel ballroom gleamed with white tablecloths and crystal chandeliers. Perfume and the sweet humidity of pressed suits filled the air. Cameras flashed like polite lightning. I moved slowly, like a person crossing a river on stones, one careful, measured step at a time. Aunt Ruth sat at my table, and I watched the room through my own steady filter. The parents laughing near the bar, Emily framed by a group of bridesmaids, the groom speaking quietly to his best man. When they asked me to make a toast, I felt the air shift around me. It was not permission so much as an expectation. The dutiful older sister who held the family's chaotic edges together. The person who could put into words a story that would make everyone agree that there was love in the room. I stood, feeling the cane make contact with the polished floor. And for a moment the world narrowed to the circumference of the nearest table. I started quietly. I thanked the couple in the way any speaker might. Familiar anecdotes, a pinch of humor. But then I paused, longer than the scripted speech required. It felt like pulling a thread that had been frayed for years. The room leaned forward without meaning to. I woke up last month after surgery to a voicemail. I said, "My father told me, very plainly, we sold your condo. We needed money for the wedding." The sentence landed like a stone in still water. Phones shifted. Wine glasses hesitated midair. I held the eyes of the two people most responsible and felt no triumph in my voice, only a precise, steady rectitude. This is the truth. I placed 2 envelopes on the table in front of me. I did not shout. I did not hurl in. I opened the first and read, with a measured calm, the words that Mark had verified. The documents in that envelope were not ornate. They were the kind of bureaucratic paper that constructs the reality of ownership. The power of attorney that had purported to authorize the sale carried a signature that did not match mine. There were dates stamped when I was in surgery. The agent who claimed to represent me had a notarized affirmation that, under careful scrutiny, unraveled. I set the forged power of attorney down, and then placed the second envelope in front of me. The deed to the house my parents lived in lay between thin sheets of cardstock. I explained, simply, that years prior I had used savings to secure that house anonymously because I could not stand to watch them lose a roof. I said I had kept it private because the intention had been to preserve, not to control. "You sold my condo while I was unconscious," I told the room, "and you used that money to carry the costs of this wedding. I am not asking for mercy. I am asking for accountability." At that point, Mark stood. He was careful in his movements, a man who felt his voice in the weight of proof. He explained, in clear language, what forgery looks like. Mismatches in handwriting, suspicious timestamps, and the legal consequences that follow from authentic evidence. He confirmed that the power of attorney was not mine. He confirmed that the deed showed my ownership of the house and that the sale of my condo had been made on a document that did not bear my consenting signature. The room sank into a kind of stunned silence. When someone clutched at a napkin, the sound felt unnecessarily loud. The groom's uncle rose and walked out. One by one, people stood, visibly rearranging themselves to reconcile this new information with the person they had sat beside all evening. Phones came out. Videos began. Emily's face went gray in a way I had never seen, like the color had been drained from the skin where remorse might have bloomed. She tried to speak, tried to shout over my words with the practiced clamor of someone who believed optics could rescue intent. She said, "Laura, this is not the place," as if the place could change the truth. I had not chosen the ballroom for spectacle. I had chosen it because witnesses mattered. When theft happens within a family, it is often smoothed by complicity, the polite deflection that says, "These things happen. I wanted the evidence to be seen by people who could not reduce it to family drama. Friends, colleagues, the groom's family, the young couple who had their first apartment elsewhere. I wanted the public eye to provide a kind of accountability that private pleas never had. What followed was not theatrics, it was consequence. Guests who had supported Emily's social ascent skated away. Conversations that had been set on polite repetition dissolved. The groom's family called an urgent meeting in a corridor. In the next hours, what had been planned as a permanent union frayed under the weight of a revelation that suggested dishonesty as a domestic currency. I do not claim a direct line that proves the marriage ended strictly because of my speech. There were many threads: trust, character, how two people reconcile family pathology, that loomed large. What I can say with certainty is that the veneer of celebration could not withstand the presence of clear evidence. There was a moment of raw human reaction that I will not embellish. Emily confronted me afterwards in a hallway, the kind of narrow space that magnifies every breath. "You ruined my wedding," she said. Her voice trembled, not with apology, but with a hurt that was fanned by people who had always told her she was owed. "You could have simply talked to us." "You sold my home while I was unconscious," I replied. "You used that money." "That's not a conversation to be held privately when facts are in the open." Her husband, now, at the very least, someone whose trust had been sorely tested, stood with his head bowed. He avoided my gaze the way people avoid the report of a bill they cannot pay. Guests left. Videos from the room spread across phones and then into inboxes and pages online. Not as a salacious clip, but as a document of accountability. A woman presenting evidence that suggested theft, a lawyer confirming it, a family rearranged by the admission. In the days after the reception, the law performed its slow, patient work. Mark filed notices. The institution of justice crept into our lives in forms and court dates and legal letters that required care and attention. I serve as a practical novelist of my own life when I recount those steps. They are not glamorous. I do not offer a manual. Legal processes vary by place. Outcomes are never guaranteed. What I can describe is what happened. The authorities recognized the irregularities, and the sale of my condo was reversed pending investigation. That alone was not the closure I needed. To ensure the harm could not be perpetuated, we used the mechanism at our disposal, nothing more exotic than a lawful enforcement of my rights. To require the occupants of the house that my parents had enjoyed to find other arrangements within a reasonable time. It felt harsh to watch two people who had once been the warm center of my life scramble for new lodging. But there is a difference between consequence and cruelty. I did not seek to leave them destitute. I sought to re-establish the boundary their actions had erased. We rented the house to a young couple who had been on a waiting list for affordable housing. The first year's income, when it arrived, was earmarked for donation to organizations that help women escape financial abuse. For me, that was not a symbolic gesture. It was a practical reorientation of the gains that had been used to take from me back into a structure that prevents similar theft. The parents were displaced, but they were not destroyed. They found a small apartment. There was embarrassment and social ostracism and long, awkward calls with people who had considered them pillars. There were family members who took sides and relatives who stopped answering calls. Emily, stripped of the social gloss the wedding promised, was forced to reckon with the consequences of a decision that had a legal footprint. Her marriage shaken, uncertain was delayed, and then quietly undone. I do not claim credit for the moral unraveling in another person's life. I claim that truth, when presented calmly and plainly, tends to move people toward clarity, even if that clarity is painful. The aftermath did not feel like a victory lap. It felt like clearing the rubble. Each document I filed was a brick laid toward a life that belonged to me again. There were nights when I cried, not out of triumph, but out of exhaustion, and the slow run of grief for the family I had thought I had, for the illusions of reciprocity that had always been conditional. Healing came in slow, measured increments. Physically, my recovery from surgery took months. I learned to run again with a body that had been patient and then betrayed. Emotionally, I learned to build fences as if they were garden walls, solid, purposeful, and not meant to keep people out for spite but intended to mark where my land ended and theirs began. I invested in a therapist who helped me see the difference between loyalty and codependency, who taught me how to say no without inflicting unnecessary harm. I restructured my finances in ways that prioritized my independence rather than enabling others' recklessness. I also made decisions about forgiveness. Forgiveness is not a single act. It is a series of choices about how to live in the presence of those who have hurt you. I chose not to erase the past. I chose not to invite the people who used me back into the rooms that I built for myself without clear boundaries. I chose charity as an act of repair because the money that had been mobilized to take from me could, in a tangible way, help people who faced similar patterns. That decision, renting the house to a deserving young couple and donating the income, felt like closing a loop. Friends asked if I felt vindicated. I told them I felt resolved. They asked if I regretted the public nature of the reveal. I admitted that part of me had feared the noise, but truth, when swallowed and smoothed inside a family like a swallowed rock, can calcify into the routines that allow abuse to recur. The ballroom was not a place of showmanship. It was a place where witnesses sat. I wanted witnesses. Over time, new rhythms came back into my life. I found a smaller house with a garden and a front door that opened to sunlight instead of old debts. I planted tomatoes. I learned to sleep without the expectation that I would be called to fix another emergency. I dated awkwardly, learning the unfamiliar vocabulary of mutuality rather than rescue. I built friendships that were not transactional. I took small trips and learned to be amused by the mundane. People often ask me about reconciliation. Will I ever speak with my parents again? Will Emily and I rebuild? The truth is that I cannot map another person's capacity for change. I can say this: boundaries are a form of self-respect. Forgiveness, if it comes, must be earned through consistent repair and through the demonstration of new habits over time. I am open to that possibility, but I am no longer willing to be the default emotional and financial responder to needs that are not mine to assume. There is a clarity now in the way my days are organized. I do not wake up looking for permission. I wake up thinking about what I want to build. A home with a dinner table for friends who are chosen rather than obligated. A life that is neat in the ways I choose. The legal resolutions and the donations did not erase the hurt. They rearranged the terms on which I would live forward. If there is a lesson to be pulled from this, it is not a prescriptive formula. This story is my story. People's lives are entangled in different ways. But if you have ever been in a situation where someone close to you crossed a line and told you, with words or deeds, that your security was negotiable, understand this: you do not have to become small to keep the peace. You do not have to accept theft as an expected part of family life. There is also a practical humility to add. Legal systems are not perfect. Outcomes vary. This account is not a how-to manual. It is a testimony of what happened in this particular set of circumstances. If you find yourself facing something like this, take care of your immediate safety first. Seek trusted advisors, and consider the kind of truth that needs to be told and the witnesses who should hear it. People reached out after the reception with stories that took my breath away. Notes from women who had been coerced into signing financial papers, from daughters who had paid off parents only to be treated as an ATM, from men and women who recognized patterns in their own families. I donated what I could, and I volunteered time to organizations working with survivors of financial abuse. For me, turning harm into help was part of recovery. It gave the wound a purpose other than pain. When I think back to that hospital bed, to the voice on the voicemail that stated a transaction like a sentence, I feel the same physical sensation I did then. A tightness. I remember the concrete shape of rage and the decision to convert it into something measured. I remember the evening in the ballroom not as a triumph but as a necessary accounting. My life is quieter now, but full. I have friends I trust. I have a home I bought with money I made and kept. I have work that fulfills me. I am not the woman who shoulders everyone's burdens to prove her worth. I am a woman who knows what belongs to her, and who will speak plainly when lines are crossed. To anyone who is listening because they have been hurt by someone who should have protected them, you are permitted to set boundaries. You are permitted to insist on accounting. You are permitted to reclaim space without apology. If you need encouragement, reach out to people you trust. There are organizations and counselors who can help you untangle the financial from the emotional. If this story resonated with you, if you have experienced a betrayal that left you reeling, I'd love to hear one word from you in the comments, a word that sums up how you felt. Please also consider sharing this with someone who needs encouragement. If you want to hear more stories of people who reclaimed their lives and created new boundaries, subscribe to the channel. In the pinned comment below, I've listed general resources and hotlines that can help with financial abuse and emotional recovery, not legal advice, just places to find support. Boundaries are survival. Choosing yourself is not selfish. It is brave.